Um, I'm Gabriel Metcalf, CEO of the Committee for Sydney. Let me begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land, for me, the Gadigal of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. I also want to acknowledge the Innovation Fund partners of the Committee for Sydney who fund the core research output of the committee: Dexis, the ICC, McKinsey, Western Sydney University, and Campbelltown City Council. Today, we are delighted to have New South Wales Minister for Planning and Public Spaces, the Honourable Rob Stokes, here with us. Minister Stokes is well known to many of you, is a very close thought partner of the committee, someone we pay a lot of attention to. And the topic he is going to speak to today is, I suppose it gets to some of the core dilemmas that any planning system faces, which is, on the one hand, how do you generate great places? On the other hand, how do you address affordability? We need a planning system that generates new development that over time makes Sydney more livable, more convenient, more resilient, and maybe even we figure out how to make new neighborhoods that people love as much as old neighborhoods. Wouldn't that be incredible? But at the same time, we need a planning system that can deliver outcomes related to affordability. At times, these goals do come into tension, and we need to face that honestly. Of course, the committee believes, and this is in some ways one of our fundamental beliefs, is that it is possible to do both things, that we can generate great places and also make Sydney more affordable. Achieving that in practice is hard. So Minister Stokes has thought about these issues as deeply as anyone has. We are pleased he's agreed to take time to share some of his thinking. So the way this works, the minister will make his remarks, then we'll do Q&A. You can submit those to me via the Q&A app on Zoom. I will do my best to sort through those. Some of you have already texted me some questions. That's fine too. So with that, Minister Stokes, take it away.
Okay. Thanks, Gabriel, and thanks everyone who's on the call. As Gabriel also indicated in his acknowledgement of country, I'm speaking to you from Gadigal country and wanted to acknowledge elders past and present and thank them for their custodianship of country. And as Gabriel also mentioned, these are tough times, but we will get through them. As you think about along the broad sweep of history, city makers and shapers have had bigger issues to deal with than we're currently dealing with. I'm thinking of sort of environmental catastrophes like the tsunami that swept through Lisbon in 1720, or the social disasters faced in rebuilding cities in Europe and Asia after the devastation of World War II, for example, or the economic disintegration of places like the Bronx or Flint or Detroit, and the rebuilding of some of those cities. So in the broad historical sweep, while we're dealing with very difficult times, others have dealt with things even more difficult, and those cities, many of those places were rebuilt and are thriving today. Gabriel also spoke to the nature of the dilemma, that at the same time as we've got to do everything we can to address housing affordability in a growing city like Sydney, we also need to do so at the same time as ensuring that we don't compromise on the quality of homes or the communities in which they're placed. In one sense, affordability could be quite easily generated by building really, really cheaply, poorly built houses with no infrastructure to support them. They would certainly be cheap and would certainly deal with affordability, but of course we wouldn't be creating the sorts of environments that we aspire for ourselves and for the communities we serve. So the challenge and the trick and the paradox is to do both of these things at once. Now, I don't propose to go into the wider debate around the challenges as to the various social and economic factors that are leading to the affordability crunch that we're facing in Sydney. Suffice to say that it's a challenge shared by global cities and many, in fact, regional areas across the world. And there are debates. I refer to the work of people like Ed Glazer or Vernon Smith or some of the great city economists as to the reasons as to why we have some of the affordability challenges we are facing. But as Gabrielle mentioned to me just before we got on the call, supply is certainly a component. As Gabrielle elegantly put it, supply is a precondition to affordability, but certainly is not by itself sufficient. So Sydney needs more homes, and there's no question about that. And also, while interest rates are low, we know that there's going to be continuing pressure on housing as an asset class. So one thing that I can do as Planning Minister is to work on the supply side, and to help ease the pressure, we're working to ensure there's a strong pipeline of housing. Remember, supply is not a noun, it's a verb in this sense. It's about a consistent, regular, certain supply, both now and into the future. So in recent months, we've rezoned or released plans for around 30,000 new homes across Sydney. In the southwest, there's 16,000 homes in places like Leppington, Lows Creek, Maryland, and Glenfield, the gateway to the Macarthur region. In the eastern city, there's a bit over 1,500 homes planned for Blackwattle Bay, about 3,000 at Waterloo, about 1,000 up my neck of the woods in Ingleside, and almost 8,000 over at Macquarie Park. With this sort of strong momentum, we're now focusing on a number of other middle ring areas of rezoning that we plan to achieve before the end of the year, including Wilton Town Centre. Again, that's in the Macarthur area, Rhodes in the central city, and Frenchs Forest in the eastern city. But what are the housing approval numbers telling us about housing supply? Certainly the latest housing approvals for new homes show that approvals are in recovery, and we've seen a sustained increase in detached housing approvals in particular over the last year. And that tells us something about the preference for detached housing that the pandemic has brought to the fore. We've also implemented a slew of reform measures, all designed at speeding up approvals and removing some of the unnecessary roadblocks to housing supply. We've in particular taken on the mammoth task of implementing reform to the infrastructure contributions system. Now, those three words, infrastructure contribution system, do not sound very sexy or interesting, and the phrase infrastructure contributions reform itself is enough to put most of us to sleep. But it is incredibly important. It is integral, and it's also a powerful reform package in terms of unlocking housing supply. We know from the work that the Productivity Commission has done that infrastructure contributions reform can unlock billions in productivity benefits and see more homes and more development come to market much quicker with the infrastructure to match it. We've seen, for example, across the city, we have tens of thousands of rezoned lots, but they were rezoned without a pathway to provide for the infrastructure necessary to support growth on those rezoned lots. In one sense, sterilising them until central government comes along and provides that infrastructure. If those infrastructure provisions were made at the point of rezoning, those lots would come online much sooner, and that's the structural problem that we're seeking to deal with right at the moment. And we have infrastructure that's currently being considered by an upper house committee that hopefully will help us resolve what is one of the most intractable problems in terms of boosting a pipeline of housing supply. Now, effectively, I think one of the things we also need to look at here is that we're not alone. The housing supply challenges we're facing in Sydney are shared right across, particularly the global north. Even though the supply boom in this city of the mid-2010s, even in that huge supply boom, new dwelling sales, even then, never made up more than 0.5% of annual dwelling turnover. So although the price of housing assets have risen significantly, with houses up about 8% over the 12 months to March, housing rents, which better reflect the utility price of housing, increased 3% for houses and actually fell 5% for units. So there's some interesting points in there that supply, to Gabrielle's point, is necessary, but itself it is not sufficient. As I mentioned, housing assets boom is a global phenomenon during COVID. In Auckland, for example, across the Dutch, prices are up 21.9%. That expands even further in regional parts of New Zealand, New Zealand, areas like Gisborne, for example, over the past year, prices have risen by a staggering almost 50%. Interestingly, the same has been matched in Britain, where we've seen price rises in London, but in regional Britain, we've seen house prices increase up to 4 times as much as the increase in London. So what we're seeing is capital city prices have increased, but regional prices have increased even more significantly. In Australia, for example, we've seen prices in regional Victoria increase much more dramatically than in Melbourne. And here, for example, the average house price in the Byron Shire is now greater than the average house price or median house price in Greater Sydney. Interestingly, even American Sunbelt cities, which have been vaunted for their very simple and liberalised planning system, we've seen house prices rise staggeringly over the past few months. In Houston and Atlanta, we saw price rises of 20% and 27% respectively. In Canada, we're seeing house prices rise even more steeply. Toronto, I think, is well over 30% over the past 12 months. So this is something that is happening everywhere. And the pandemic in that sense has been a bit of a shake-up for interest rates, we know that, but also for city shaping more broadly, just like, as I said before, the Spanish flu did in the 1920s. One particular side effect of the pandemic is it's shaping the state of housing in New South Wales, is that it's making it easier to work beside the beach in Newcastle or in the Tweed Shire or next to a winery in Orange or in Wagga Wagga. Due to a range of factors, including the changing nature of work, as well as the rise of short-term accommodation, what's new this time around is that there's also unprecedented pressure on the rental housing market of the regions. Now, the factors driving the supply conversation about housing affordability are fundamentally different from last time that we experienced this back in 2017. We've established a regional housing supply task force to provide solutions for the barriers to new housing in these regional areas. Of course, this pressure on housing in the regions also means there's pressure on our CBDs to convert from commercial to other uses. In cities, centres, for example, with millions and millions of square metres of floor space, often held as long-term investments, looking for steady and certain income. This floor space may look very different in the future, whether it's commercial floor space or perhaps as apartments in shared leases. Another side of the pandemic is the record low interest rates set by the RBA and central banks around the world. That essentially means access to money is almost free, which increases the amount that people can borrow and therefore pay to get the home that they want to live in or invest in. But perhaps the greatest lesson we need to take from the pandemic when planning for the future of our cities is a huge focus that's been given to the importance of public spaces. While it's easy to think that planning for housing is one thing and planning for public space is another, I think, and pertinent to this conversation, the sign of good housing is the quality of the spaces in between. We know very clearly, the evidence shows us, that poor access to public space can have a very detrimental impact on our health, on our well-being. This has been very clearly demonstrated during lockdown, and it's really important that our neighbourhoods can address the needs that people don't necessarily have in their own homes. We've seen this actually more dramatically overseas than we have in Sydney, where we do have access to more public open space, but we've seen sort of dramatic cleavages between the haves and the have-nots in many global cities in relation to their access to public spaces and just how important these are to our well-being. So what I particularly want to do, recognising my title is not just about planning, but it's also about public spaces, is that we give a sharp focus to the way we plan for our housing and design our housing to ensure that everybody, regardless of where they live in the state, has access to good quality housing and good quality spaces and places in between those houses, because recognising the two are really opposite sides of the same coin. It's important to note that we are committed to growth, but we are not committed to growth at any cost. I think the important point here is that growth can be either good or bad, and the point that the committee has really been an advocate for a long period of time is good growth. That is growth that is equated with human progress. So while we're committed to speeding up our planning system, we won't be hitting a panic button and opening up floodgates to housing of the lowest common denominator. We need the right housing in the right area at the right time. So we simply won't be plonking homes in the middle of nowhere without jobs, without access to quality open spaces, without access to healthcare or education, or all those sorts of things that create great communities. That's part of what our infrastructure contributions agenda is all about, to make sure that housing is aligned with roads, with sewage, with water, with schools, with libraries, community facilities, and, as I mentioned, high quality public spaces. And that's what really brings me on to talking about design and place, and our focus on integrating all the various design requirements that we've got across the planning system and putting them in one policy and in one place. We know from cities around the world that minimum design standards don't and won't result in minimum prices. Again, the lower you have design standards doesn't necessarily impact on lower cost of housing. There's a wider variety of factors that apply to solving that conundrum. There is an argument propagated by some that high design standards drive higher housing costs and are an inhibitor to housing affordability. The great risk, I think, and I'd caution in this mindset, is that without intervention, there's no incentive to lift housing standards at all. Housing costs will continue to increase, irrespective of any environmental or design benefit that'll serve the wider community. Lessons learned from the introduction of neighbours or Green Star or basics tools is the typical cycle for any intervention or change includes early resistance to lifting standards in accordance with long-term targets before technology and society catches up and carries the market forward, making it in everyone's interest to continue to improve standards. And certainly, if we're going to have a shared target of reaching net zero by 2050, then we have to look at the contribution of the built environment if that's a standard that we want to achieve as a community. I think similar lessons can be learnt from the last housing boom around 2017, when there was a focus on unlocking housing supply and getting approvals done. The problem was many proposals, because they were not thoughtfully designed, were met by community opposition and ended up being stalled in their tracks months later. We need to then rise above this ideological divide between overdevelopment and undersupply and find the right balance that prioritises good planning and good growth in the right areas at the right time. And recognising housing needs are complex. It's not just about supply of any one product. It's about supply of what the community wants, recognising that we've got a diverse range of families in our community and they don't all need the same thing. It's not a sort of Leave It to Beaver 1950s style development where everyone wants to live in a 4-bedroom house in the suburbs. We need altogether more supply of different housing products, different types of housing, and certainly different tenures, recognising that owner occupation is only one way of living in a home and having a sense of ownership of the community of which you're part. So then, how can we encourage development that's more thoughtful and more considerate to the context in which it sits within? And how can we ensure that using design as a tool means that we're going to have fewer NIMBYs and more YIMBYs, especially in infill areas where resistance tends to be strongest? Our design and place policy is really focusing for development to think outside itself. For example, how does it contribute to its neighbour, its street, its community, its suburb and its place? I like to think in terms of, the economists talk about public goods, things that are non-rival and non-exclusive. And the built design fits into that very clearly, because the way in which structures interact with the environment around it is something that affects all of us and is the democratic side of design. And that's why we really need to be very thoughtful and careful about how we design new developments, because we all have an interest in it. We all share in the consequences of good or of badly designed buildings and places. So we need to make sure that new developments encourage things like human-centred places, cycling over cars, ensure more people have access to green spaces. And we need to build apartments with working in home in mind. So, to provide comfortable and quiet places to work from home, which are now going to be considered a new essential. We also need better planning at the precinct scale, so that those sorts of decisions about walking or cycling will be easier to make, and so that people have access to parks, because we know that with better access to parks, that will have quite profound indirect benefits towards our health system and reduce the need to spend on problems that can be avoided with properly designed places. And again, there's plenty of evidence, and I commend to you the work of people like Jennifer Kent or Susan Thompson to look at the clear health benefits of quality design. And again, that's something that's in all of our benefits. Changes to apartment design can really ensure that there's things like natural ventilation, more flexible layouts for families, provision of adequate storage areas, desk spaces, usable balconies, adequate levels of sunlight, all of these things that in a developed nation where we should be aspiring for really high quality environments for everyone to have access to, as a real point of having a fair and a just city. These are the sorts of design parameters that we really need to focus on, because I think it's a really part of having a democratic and inclusive society to make sure that people have access to well-designed housing. The Design and Place State Environment Planning Policy will also be the first of its kind in the way it aims to set out the principles for good design and good places. So we really want it to be principle-based, a strategic document, rather than embedded in volumes and volumes of prescriptive rules that themselves can be inaccessible for ordinary people to understand. Principle, standards and guidance work together. It's not one without the other. We need to recognise that so many of the, if we're applying blanket rules, they can not consider nuance between regional or local variation. For example, climate itself. We know from one site to another there can be dramatic differences in localised microclimates. So having a one-size-fits-all approach just doesn't allow us to factor in those sorts of nuances that a more principle-based system allows us to do. Of course, there's always going to be a place for prescription within local planning controls, and getting that balance right by ensuring that we have simple principles, but also a benchmark of baseline rules for those who need that very strong guidance will, of course, still be provided. So there's so many reforms I could continue to talk about, but I'm mindful I've taken a lot of time already. But certainly we're doing what we can to boost more and more supply. I've spoken about the 30,000 new lots developed so far just over the last couple of months, and the directions for the next precincts that will be delivered. Spoken also about our focus on public spaces, our focus on design and on place, and also on infrastructure contributions. And I've called everyone on the call. Infrastructure contributions is a very hard area of reform, and it's a very hard area to get a general agreement toward. But I can be absolutely confident to all of you that the best way that I can serve you and serve the broader community is by having a very clear system of identifying who will pay for the infrastructure that's required to unlock new supply. Without that, sadly, we're going to continue to have these challenges of a mismatch between supply and demand, and rezoning by itself won't be enough to ensure that we have access to the infrastructure that we need to turn these lots into new homes. Thanks very much, and I'll hand back to Gabe for questions.
Okay, thanks very much, Minister. And everybody feel free to submit questions via the chat function. And I've got some that were sent to me in advance, and really looking forward to this discussion. So Minister, first of all, with regard to greenfield development, are you confident that the settings are right so that the kinds of places that are created are going to meet your definition of good growth? Is it possible to make new neighborhoods in a greenfield context that, at least in the future, when the trees come in, people will really love the way they love old neighborhoods? If the settings are not right, what needs to change?
Well, a couple of things, Gabe. I think the first thing comes back to infrastructure. Again, that's why it's so important to have the settings right early on, which is what my infrastructure contributions package is seeking to do, to make sure that at the point of rezoning, when new value is created, that some of that value pays for the infrastructure that's going to be required to make them great places. Because often what we do by rezoning first and then figuring out infrastructure contributions later is so much of that value has already been pocketed. And it ends up that the rest of the community, who may not be beneficiaries of this uplift in growth, end up having to foot the bill for things that don't actually contribute, in any direct sense toward their welfare. And so I think and that's a fundamental point of justice as well, that the beneficiaries of government decision making should contribute toward the costs that those decisions generate. And what does that mean in practice? It means things like, as you pointed to, not just tree planting. And I think, tree planting is a great place to start. But in doing so, we actually, and this is one of the big things the Design in Place set seeks to do, is getting the subdivision patterns right in the first place. Again, something that really horrified me is that subdivision, there's not a lot of design thought goes into subdivision. And that's been a cultural thing and a historical thing for a long period of time. Subdivisions are generally done by land surveyors, a great bunch of people, but they're not necessarily urban designers. And so not a lot of thought necessarily goes into things such as, we had a huge conversation with part of the development community in relation to our desire that there be sufficient room in lots for detached housing in southwest Sydney to provide space, and we're talking about detached homes, to provide space to plant a tree in the backyard. There's huge resistance, suggestion that, that'll create huge affordability challenges. But when you think about it, I think if you spoke to the general community, there would be an expectation that if we're talking about a detached house, surely there should be sufficient space to plant a tree in the backyard. So there's a lot of there's a lot of challenge in doing these sorts of things. But I also think, actually, more than backyards, I think the nature strips are actually a really important component of developing these sorts of places, because let's face it, with lot sizes where they are, there's going to be a lot more opportunity for, rather than having private open space for active recreation, a lot of that active recreation is going to be on the streets, it's going to be on the sidewalks, it's going to be in those places. So to create a canopy of trees and create mechanisms for councils to actually ensure that trees aren't just planted but are sustained, and to create sort of linear parks that people feel safe walking in and sending their kids out into, is a really big part of that. So it's about creating community, and I think sometimes that's lost in just the talk on housing supply. If all we're talking about is housing supply, that's necessary but not sufficient. To supply housing, we need to supply the infrastructure to make sure that those houses are actually homes and not just structures that no one wants to live in.
Minister, it sounds like you've got a lot riding on contributions reform. If this turns out the way you hope, can you describe how that system will work?
Yeah, well, really very simply, contributions haven't grown. I think the challenge is the contributions system dates from about 1991, 92. Our expectations have shifted dramatically since then, which is a great thing. Our society, it's a great example of how we've progressed. We expect more. We expect better for our families, for our children, for our neighbours. And so the nature of infrastructure that we expect, our sensitivity toward environmental issues has increased, and our understanding of quality of life has increased over the past 30 years. But our mechanisms for paying for this stuff hasn't increased as well. So what success looks like is where effectively at the point of rezoning, we have a method, a guaranteed method of providing the funding necessary to pay for the infrastructure the community will need. In one sense, I'm shocked to hear myself saying we don't currently have that, but it's something we've never had. And the reason we've never had it is because while it's in everyone's interests to have it, it's in a whole lot of specific interests to stop one element of it happening. And it's like contributions reform involves things that councils will love but landowners will hate, things that landowners will love but councils will hate, things that governments will love but councils will. It goes on, but effectively we've got to realise that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And yes, we're going to need to identify at the beginning how are we going to, particularly the biggest single component of cost in relation to contributions is land. We need to figure out a way to factor in how to pay for land costs, whether that be for things like trunk drainage, whether it's for open space, whatever that land is required for, a mechanism to identify right at the beginning, right at the rezoning, what is the instrument that is going to allow us to identify a certain route of paying for that land or obtaining that land. And that's why this percentage land contribution element, which particularly landowners are resistant to, is so important, because land's the biggest thing, the biggest cost that means that things like Section 711 plans have not worked as effectively as they could. So I'm really strong on this. Contributions reform. I can't deliver effective planning reform without contributions reform. It's that simple.
Okay, so many great questions here. I'm going to try to get through as many as I can. People are really interested in what you're talking about, Minister. Yesterday, we did one of these talking about climate resilience and the kind of economic and risk management dimensions of that. And part of the conversation got to an issue the committee has been pushing, which is that homes have been built and have been permitted in the floodplain where it really does not look like it's safe to live. And we actually called for putting in place a program so that over time people have the opportunity to shift into places that are less dangerous. But certainly the first thing you'd want to do is do no more further harm. That of course would impact some of the land supply. But what are your views on wrestling with that?
Well, risk is everywhere. We don't live in a risk-free world, and planning is both spatial and temporal. So something that but the challenge is here that our system of land subdivision and ownership is not temporal. It's sort of fixed in time. I'll give you an example. I went a few years ago up to East Timor, and it was shortly after a tsunami, and there was a town that had effectively been destroyed some months before, and I went through it, and it was there. And I was like, what happened? Like, I thought this town was destroyed. And they said, oh, it was. And I thought the coastline had been changed, and it was. But they'd simply just rebuilt the town. The coastline had changed, but because they had a more communal system of land ownership, they just built the houses roughly where they were, proximate to the shoreline that had changed shape. In Australia, that couldn't happen because the land has literally, that people own, is now in the ocean. So because we've got such a solidified system of land subdivision and cadastral-based ownership and torrents title, we don't have the flexibility. Of course, that's really important because that allows capital accumulation and all the things that allows for our economy to operate. So I think the first thing we need to do is to identify risk and call it out. And then that will be factored into other prices for insurances and so forth. That'll help people make decisions, to help people to make rational decisions about where they live. There have been plenty of examples I can point to people on the call of where we've tried to have things like rolling easements or timed zonings or timed uses or meanwhile uses. Generally, they haven't worked terribly well. So I think the best thing we can do is, as you indicated, the question is, first, let's not make any more bad decisions. And I'm reminded by two authors, Riddle and Webber, who talked about wicked problems, which was when humans intervene in a system, it'll create a problem that can never actually be solved. It can only ever really be managed. So to that sense, try to manage the problems we have by having safe evacuation routes and those sorts of things. But also recognise that risk, you can never have a risk-free subdivision. There will always be something that could possibly go wrong. I know, Gabe, you're from the Bay Area. I mean, that place, San Francisco itself is a particularly risky place to have built a city. In terms of risk, I think Sydney has fewer risks. But again, as we as we go outward, particularly in the northwest, it does become more and more problematic. But again, the main issues there are, again, around infrastructure. If we can have safe evacuation routes from the flood-prone areas through the areas that could be developed, but for the need to have efficient evacuation routes from the areas that are flood-prone, then there are plenty of it we can develop safely.
Oftentimes those evacuation routes just fill up and become part of the motorway network or the feeder system into the motorways. It's hard to keep the capacity preserved for evacuation once it exists. But yeah, hear your point.
That's a whole other argument.
Minister, a couple of people asking, why has there been, quote unquote, a backflip on build to rent planning controls in central Sydney?
I don't know what that's a reference to. I'm not sure what that's a reference to, but I'm certainly very keen to see build to rent. I think that's a really important part of, I talked earlier about tenure types.
Yep.
The beauty of build to rent in places like central commercial districts is it's convertible. It doesn't get started. I'm so happy to look at what that's a reference to, but certainly I'm very keen to see build to rent.
Minister, does your ministry have a role in the supply of social housing? Sydney does not have a lot of that compared to many world cities. It has not been increasing. What are your views on social housing as distinct from market rate?
Yeah. So, well, look, I mean, I think the first thing is, I prefer to talk about housing, not about any different categories of housing. I think there has been, I think, a bit of a cultural problem about any housing other than owner-occupied housing. It's really interesting. In the United States, the great American dream is, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. The great Australian dream is ownership of a detached house in the suburbs. And I think that's a very old-fashioned way of looking at the world. Ownership itself, I don't think, is absolutely critical. It's access to decent quality housing and some sort of security of tenure to ensure that you can't get booted out of the place that you call home without sufficient notice. And so I'm not, and maybe you expect me to say this as a Liberal politician, I'm not so fussed about who owns the house. And I certainly don't think the public owning housing is a terribly efficient way of providing housing, but I'm less worried about the tenure and more about the provision. But certainly it is my colleague, Mel Pavey, who's the Minister for Housing. So she has the, in terms of the social housing stock, whether it's the Land and Housing Corporation or the Aboriginal Housing Office, there's certainly things that are in her direct bag of responsibilities. But, more broadly, housing generally, whether it's social, whether it's affordable, I think affordable housing has become too limited in this city. When you look at where affordable housing, access to affordable rental housing caps out, it's at a very low threshold. And I think, there are plenty of people who are on not inconsiderable incomes who need access to some sort of affordable housing, because market housing is just not, and even if I were to triple the supply of new housing, it would still not touch the sides in terms of the affordability required for that, for many people who, 30 years ago may well have been looking to buy their first home. I think, for many of those people, we're going to need a range of different rental products or shared equity products, which I don't think will be social housing. I think the role of community housing providers is a big area here as well. But where government needs to step in, of course, government should step in. But I think, personally, government owning housing is probably the least efficient way to do it.
Right. Well, the network of CHPs in Sydney is quite wonderful. A lot of capacity there. Presumably, if you were to increase the supply, that's who would be owning or at least managing it, is the CHPs.
Yeah, definitely.
Sounds like that's what you're saying. Talking about affordability, there's a real trade-off between housing affordability and transport affordability. And just to take an American example, the Sunbelt cities that are very affordable, like the Houstons, or the Dallases. Households, I think on average, spend more per month on transport than they do on housing, because every adult has to own a car and they have to drive it a lot. Whereas you live in New York, you spend very little on transport and it all goes to housing. In some cases, really addressing true household affordability, just solving for the affordability of housing, but putting them in a place where they're going to have to spend a huge amount on transport is actually not solving the problem. So how do we make sure the planning system is able to address that deeper understanding of affordability?
Well, some of that, I think, is a really good question and really profound question. I think you're absolutely right. I think we need to look at household affordability more than the components of things you afford, because even housing affordability, effectively, generally, I think most people talk about, again, in terms of owner occupation, not about the not about the affordability of a house over time, which comes down to things like the efficiency of how the house operates, so energy costs, those sorts of things, which often I think that the measurement of a building is not the first person who owns it, but the second person who owns it, because that's when you really find if it's performing effectively. There's one of those paradoxes. If we provide great public transport infrastructure, then that will studies will show, that will increase average house prices around that transport infrastructure. So you've got that trade-off. I think sometimes, technology in society will move quicker than government intervention. And I think here, the great, one of the both tantalizing and terrifying things of the pandemic is it's demonstrating that people can work more effectively from home. Density is solved more than just putting people next to each other. It's more by connecting people better with each other. That's terrifying in one sense, because it's great. It means you can work happily in your Ugg boots in Bexley or Bankstown. But the problem with that is if it's an urban if it's a service related industry, well, you could just as easily do that in Bangkok or Bangalore, which I think will be the next big challenge in relation to workplace flexibility.
Yeah. Minister, you were very eloquent about some of the major structural factors that impact affordability that don't have to do with just supply of housing. What sometimes gets probably falls under the label, the financialization of housing. So the whole world, central banks all over the world are trying to stimulate the economy now with low interest rates, which is driving an asset bubble in real estate in many, many countries. That's an obvious thing happening here. The tax structure in Australia it has a huge impact on affordability. We saw Labor go to the last federal election with some reform ideas that did not seem to go over very well. Fundamentally, there's this problem that if you already own your own home, you don't want housing to get more affordable. You want your home to go up in value. And so people want affordability in general, but they don't want their home price to go down. So we are stuck with a real paradox. And the UK and the US are stuck in that exact same dilemma. Do you have any ideas of politically feasible ways of addressing some of these financialization causes of housing unaffordability? Or is this just something we have to note and try to overcome somewhere else?
I think you expressed all of the problems really eloquently just then. And I think the first thing we need to do is recognise how difficult it is. And so have a gradual path and have one that looks into the future, but doesn't have retrospective effect on decisions that people have already made or relied upon. You'll see that, with the rise of Uber, what that meant for taxi plates or these sorts of things. You need to provide a pathway to recognise things need to change, but we don't want to create losers who invested on the basis of what the settings were at that time. So I think, Dom Perrottet's land tax reforms, I think, are a good way to look at it in terms of you will have a choice to either pay stamp duty or land tax to gradually move toward a new system of contributing toward toward taxation in a way that has a nexus to your property ownership. rather than just a one-off stamp duty, for example. That's one example of a gradual way to look at the problem, to solve the problem over 50 years. Because the problem is we keep saying, oh, it's too hard, so no one does anything, so another 50 years passes and we still haven't addressed the problem. So the first thing is to recognise how difficult it is. The second thing is to start now. The third thing is not to try to do everything at once. I think that was where Labor really fell into a problem at the last federal election. Arguably, any one of those things that they might have looked at might have made sense, but by putting them all together, they scared the horses. And I think, frankly, I think they were so confident that they were going to win that election. They thought in the last couple of weeks, let's get a mandate for everything we want to do, and in that way, they actually undermined their chances of being elected. I think the other thing, as a fundamental starting point, which I think is always the best way to look at these problems or questions, what are we trying to do? I would have thought the first thing to do is to say, as a community, we want to ensure that everyone can have access to a decent home before we worry about trying to incentivise people to collect more homes. Let's just give everyone one first, and then let's help others to get multiple homes if that's what they want to do. I would have thought, as a simple proposition, that's probably a good starting point.
Wow, that's quite profound. If you were to act on that simple proposition, it would drive a lot of changes, wouldn't it? All right, let's talk about the design in place SEP, a very ambitious reform you are driving. I think you explained it quite well. I can share that having canvassed some of our members, a lot of our members about this, if I can make an overgeneralization, the architects love it and the planners do not. And I think that's because architects want the flexibility to do great things, and planners tend to believe more in form controls that will not depend on there being a good architect. It reminds me a bit of this running debate between London and New York, where New York has a rules-based system and the UK has more of a judgment-based system, and they from time to time think about adopting ideas from the other one. But I believe the way you are trying to set this up, there will actually be both. There will be a baseline of form controls that live in the local planning rules, and you can follow those if you want. So that keeps the planners happy. But if you want to propose something that goes above and beyond, you now have a much more clear benchmark on what that would achieve. Can you maybe talk about how these two ideas can be in a helpful coexistence rather than something that just makes it all more complicated?
Yeah, thank you. And Gabrielle, you again put it so elegantly. I mean, we get this right and it becomes really simple for everyone. We get it wrong and it's just a horrible mess. And I totally understand that. But we had to start with the point of consulting everybody. And when you consult everybody, of course, everyone's worst fears come out. But look at my perspective, the opposite was not consulting everyone and putting out what we thought was exactly the right thing to do. And of course, everyone would have been horrified that they hadn't been consulted. So no matter which way we went about this, it was always going to create controversy. And I actually think that's great. The point that there is contest, I don't see as a problem. I actually am grateful that people are engaged. And from this point, we put all the ideas out there. At this point, we pare them back and actually, sort of co-create something that works for everybody. I think your point as well about the UK and the US system is really good, because we're trapped somewhere in the middle, and we always have been, and that's been a real problem of our planning system. A bit like our political system, they call it, half Washington, half Westminster, they call it Westminster. A bit the same. We've got discretion and we've got land use zoning, and we've meshed them all in together. So we're always going to have that tension and that problem. And the challenge is we tend to get the worst of both systems, we tend the best of both systems. And that's really, to your point, it's effectively for those who want to follow rules, potentially volume builders or people who just want a replicable product that they can just pump out, there will be rules. but as simple and as easy to follow for mums and dads and everyone as possible. Don't make them overly complex or overly prescriptive, but they do need to be a baseline for the minimum performance that we seek to see. But we don't want those rules to strangle innovation, because particularly in this area, and with design, I mean, how, regulating design is anti-design. You sort of, it's almost oxymoronic. You can't, design by its nature is thoughtful and reflective, and beauty itself. In one sense, if you have a requirement that things must be beautiful, well, I don't know what that looks like, but I know as a principle that's something we could aspire to. I also think sometimes rules can give us weird and wonderful results. For example, a few years ago, I was at an architecture award ceremony where the award for sustainability went to a holiday home created entirely out of concrete. But it had wonderful, breezeways or something, I don't know. But I just thought, because one of the things we don't look at is materials, for example, or size of dwellings or purpose of dwellings. For an example, we tend to measure sometimes the wrong things. Or a good example, Hunter Water did an audit for us a while ago because I wanted to know how many water tanks that are imposed through basic standards, how many of them are connected after 5 years. The audit showed that about 60% remain connected, and the other 40% are just bits of petrochemicals sitting in people's backyards doing absolutely nothing. So, we can do better, and I think everyone would agree with that. The point is to get to a point where it does both. It has the rules for those who want to follow the rules, but it has the capacity for those who want to go beyond the rules and do something even better. We will embrace that too.
A question about the blue-green grid. The metropolis of 3 cities put forward this beautiful poetic notion of the parklands city. You've spoken a lot about the idea of Sydney as the city in the park. With regard to Western Sydney, where some of the new greenfield development is going to be going, as well as a lot of infill, what is it going to take to make the vision of the parkland city real?
Parks, and that's simple to say, but much harder to do, because of course parks are on land, and land is owned by people, and people have expectations about return and all the rest of it. But again, it's in everybody's interests to provide this parkland, except for the person on whose land the park sits. And so we need to have proper mechanisms and fair mechanisms for acquiring it. We need to be as thoughtful as possible into the future of acquiring land early, before it goes up in value. And we need to be very thrifty with our use of parkland. For example, a good example would be the canals in Western Sydney, leading to Prospect Reservoir itself. These utility corridors, can be reimagined as linear parks and parkland, and be much more thoughtful about the way in which we use the land resources we already have. But this goes to some of the challenges we're having around planning for the metropolis. Fundamental to that city, to make that city work, I think everyone would agree it needs to be based around parkland. But of course, zoning for that is altogether more difficult, and we need to be very careful, because often the easiest thing to do is to rezone the land for parkland on people who are least able to speak for themselves. And so we need to be, have a real equity lens over that, and that's what Roberta Ryan is doing out there, to make sure that people who might be some of the less sophisticated investors in that area are not unfairly impacted. But equally, sometimes there are lands that are not developable. They're not useful from a development perspective, either because, as we talked about earlier, they're flood prone, or maybe they've got really significant biodiversity on them. Well, that's a good starting point to look at parkland, is land that can't otherwise be developed.
A question about middle ring suburbia. Some parts of Sydney, I'll just say what the question is, have seem neglected, so low quality, low amenity, but affordable, medium or high density, what can you do for those kinds of places to turn around either the perception or the reality of them?
I'm trying to visualize. So effectively, the question's asking me with areas that are middle ring but high density but low amenity, what can we do for them? Okay. Well, this is the trick, isn't it? Because often, the areas that are politically easiest to see more higher-rise development in the middle ring are the areas that are not as desirable, often the areas that are a bit further away from train stations. Equally, often they're the areas where you don't have the same sorts of amenity or heritage concerns. So, they're the more car-dependent areas that were developed in the 60s and 70s that no one really misses if they are redeveloped, but don't have that proximity. I think the answer is to try and create the communities around them and to try and relax as far as we can the zonings to allow the shops and the retail and all those sorts of things to migrate to those areas. And that's part of what we're seeking to do through the E-zones review or the employment zones review to try and liberate land uses. But again, it's one thing that councils are so fiercely protective of are the R2 zones, and they're almost the hardest area to generate change. The one thing I would say though is there's a lot of land in Sydney. We don't have to develop everything everywhere. If there are areas where the local community really doesn't want a particular type of growth, we can actually listen to that. We don't. I'm fond of saying there's more than 12,000 square kilometres in Greater Sydney, which is the same size as Singapore that has 719 square kilometres. So we've got plenty of space. We've got the flexibility of actually listening to the community, and if development is really resisted for a particular reason, a particular area, we can listen to that. A good example would be Ryde, where I think the community is fairly clear. One side of Epping Road, where the train stations are around Macquarie Park, that area, absolutely appropriate for very significant redevelopment. The other side of Epping Road, we'd prefer it to remain largely the same, and we can accommodate that.
All right, we are at time. Sorry everybody if I didn't get to your questions. I tried to get to as many as I could. Could do this all day, Minister. Any closing thoughts?
Look, just to, I guess, encourage everyone on the call. I know people must be frustrated. I'm frustrated. There's uncertainty, and it's a very difficult time. What I'm encouraging my own team to do is to reflect on the strategic policies. What are we going to do? The world's going to change, and that's exciting. And I think actually, pandemics of the past have always fostered change in city shaping, and generally they've been really positive changes. So I'm actually quite excited as to what our city and our state can look like on the other side of this. And I think that's where we should, focus on supporting one another through the hard times, but be very excited about the future, because I think it'll be profoundly for the good in the long term, despite the hardship at the moment.
Okay, Minister, thank you for the work you are doing. Thank you for making time for this. And everybody, thanks for joining. We'll see you at the next one.
Thanks, Gabe.